What changes to Tennessee's gun laws will you commit to if you are Tennessee's next governor?
Well, so I think the kind of overarching thing that I would describe is I promise, and I've made this commitment some time ago and have made it clear for quite some time that I favor true constitutional carry in Tennessee. And so, we will do all of the steps that are necessary, or I will champion them at least. I know the legislature has to come along for the ride on this, but I will lead the effort from the standpoint of being governor of Tennessee to make sure that we have true constitutional carry. So that would include amending our constitution to clean up the problems that exist there. I know that will be a multi-year process, but hopefully with the support of a governor that wants to see that done, we can bring the legislature along. And then we will also, repeal, or I will lead the effort to see that we repeal the intent to go armed statute and the park statute. And then, I think there will likely be other things we want to do as well, but I think those are the critical ones.
What existing laws, regulations, or executive orders do you believe currently violate either the Tennessee Constitution or the Second Amendment relative to the rights of an individual to keep, bear, or wear arms?
Well, I guess I've already covered that to some degree. I mean, obviously, I think the language of our own Constitution, the Tennessee Constitution, is out of step with the current understanding that Supreme Court has enunciated in their recent rulings about what the Second Amendment means. And so, I don't know that we, technically, I guess we'd say you wouldn't have to change that, but I think it would be best to change it because we don't know what the future might hold and what future courts might do. So I think we need to get our own state constitution cleaned up, and then the statutes that I mentioned before should be stricken. We should repeal them and make sure that they're out of the way. And then in terms of the broader things that the governor can do, I think we want to, in every way we can, that's consistent with other rights. There are certainly times when the various constitutional rights, come into conflict with one another. But generally speaking, I fully favor allowing Tennesseans to fully avail themselves of their Second Amendment rights. And for me, and I've spoken on this extensively, the Second Amendment certainly, it allows us to keep and bear arms for purposes of defending ourselves against our fellow American citizens, United States citizens. But I think the real intent of the framers when they put the Second Amendment in to the Bill of Rights was to equip U.S. citizens with the capacity to defend God-given rights, but set forth in our Constitution. I think the Second Amendment is indispensable to safeguarding not only Second Amendment rights, but all of the other rights that are embodied in our Constitution and in the amendments to the Constitution.
Given that the authority to make law is constitutionally vested in the legislature, what powers of the office of governor would you exercise to remove statutory or regulatory restrictions in Tennessee on the Second Amendment rights protected by the constitutions?
Well, so, obviously acting under the limitations and the powers and authorities that the Constitution grants the executive branch, the governor in Tennessee, and in keeping with the statutes that are in place, I think you want a governor who will, work to fully implement the statutes, commit to not in, trampling on those rights with any of the actions that the governor takes. So, for example, it's deeply troubling to me that we have seen prior governors use the power and authorities of the executive branch to try to both influence the legislature and stand in the way of the implementation of the freedoms and liberties that are captured in the statutes that have passed. And so I would pledge to make sure that the various departments of state government were abiding by, in the fullest way, the rights that are protected under Tennessee's Constitution and under the U.S. Constitution, and that we are fully upholding the laws of the country.
Do you support the decision of current Governor Bill Lee and Attorney General Scarametti to appeal the ruling in Hughes v. Lee? And on that topic, if you are governor, what will you do if that case is still pending?
Well, so no, I do not support their approach. I think that we had a favorable court ruling and we should have let it stand. And it would have been my direction with respect to the powers of the governor to let the ruling of the circuit court here stand. And I would have obviously the governor doesn't tell the attorney general what to do, and the attorney general is selected through a path that doesn't include the governor's involvement. But I would certainly have encouraged the attorney general to, as he has in other cases, simply abide by and let the ruling of the trial court stand. And that's what I would encourage the attorney general to do. And that's what I would direct, as far as the powers of the office of the governor, that's what I would direct to be done.
How do you define which arms, as that term is used in the Constitution, are protected by the Second Amendment or the Tennessee Constitution? And which type of weapons, including categories of firearms, do you believe should be prohibited to individual ownership?
Yeah, so I think that the framers were speaking very broadly when they used the term arms. And so I know this doesn't sit well with some people, but I don't currently see that there are any contemplated restrictions on what, if you look back, I guess you look at the historical context, you think about what the current Supreme Court rulings say. I think that the framers, again, wanted to equip American citizens, United States citizens, with the right to defend themselves against tyranny. And so I think they contemplated the full breadth of arms to be within the scope of that. And that's the view that I would have as governor.
Do you believe that an individual has the constitutionally protected right to own and bear arms that are typically carried by the modern individual soldier?
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question about that. Again, I think I just answered that question. I think that the framers were worried about equipping citizens with the ability to push back against tyranny. And so I think we want American citizens equipped with the ability to carry the arms that are necessary to defend liberty.
Are there any weapons that an individual soldier today might be issued that you believe that individual citizens should not be allowed to own?
I don't believe so. I think the scope was intended to be broad. There were more powerful weapons available in the time of the drafting of the Second Amendment provision. And if the framers had meant to constrict that in some way, I think they would have contemplated that, and they did not. And again, I think for the very purpose of why they saw the Second Amendment as indispensable to the freedoms that needed to be protected.
Current Tennessee law creates several gun free zones that are subject to criminal enforcement, including any privately owned property that the owner manager decides to post. What gun free zones do you believe are allowable under the shall not be infringed mandate of the Second Amendment?
Well, I think we can look to the current Supreme Court precedent that basically sets forth that the historical context test of what would have been on the minds of the framers at the time. I think that's a good starting point for how we look at this. I do think there are those occasions where, kind of under the castle, with respect to protecting personal property rights, that if I have a personal residence or a farm and I don't want people to carry firearms on my property, then I think it should be within the province of my rights to say, you're not welcome on my property. And that would include saying, you can't bring your firearms on my property. I think, though, if we're talking about property rights with respect to public conveniences, so when you're holding yourself out as a place that the public is invited to come to do business with you or for you to provide a service or market to them, then I think the right of the Second Amendment clearly should become priority, because we don't want people who are involved in the the public marketplace to be rendered defenseless. And so I would favor, in that case, favoring the Second Amendment right over individual property rights, and that in the case of public conveniences, that the Second Amendment right should be supreme.
Currently, the governor alone has decided that the state capital is a gun-free zone. What will you do if elected governor with respect to whether citizens can carry on publicly owned or managed properties?
Yeah, so I think that there are places, and clearly this current Supreme Court precedent contemplates that there are places where you might say, on the basis of what the founders and the framers thought, and again, current Supreme Court precedent, that there are places where maybe emotions might be high enough that we historically would have restricted, the carrying of firearms. I personally don't believe the Capitol rises to that level, and I believe the General Assembly has made it clear that their offices are not gun-free zones, and so I think it's reasonable that the Capitol should not be a gun-free zone. At least that's my current thinking on that.
Currently, Attorney General's committee is fighting to retain 2 gun control laws that have been declared unconstitutional by a 3-judge trial court. Do you believe that Tennessee law should be changed to establish a publicly elected official whose job focuses on identifying and removing potentially unconstitutional laws or regulations from Tennessee, including bringing civil actions against the state to protect and restore constitutionally protected rights?
Well, that's an issue I haven't contemplated a lot, but I do believe that we should constantly be reassessing the laws of the past, and that may have been put in place when, unfortunately, different perspectives prevailed. And so I do think we should be looking at our laws, not just with respect to gun rights, but particularly with respect to gun rights, given the importance of them, to make sure that we don't have legacy laws that are unnecessarily intruding in any way upon the Second Amendment right. And so I think it does make sense to empower someone within state government to be proactively looking for problems that might exist. And so I think that idea makes a lot of sense. Obviously, you would hope in a vibrant, state government that our elected legislators would be looking for those opportunities and would be responsive to the public. But we know sometimes it's easy to be maybe a little bit lazy, or maybe not as proactive as we should be. And so I don't think we should just sit idly by and accept the status quo, and particularly when it comes to any statutes or regulations that are unnecessarily and unconstitutionally limiting the rights of the citizens of Tennessee.
Over the last 30 years, various taxpayer-funded individuals and departments, including the Department of Safety, the TBI, and local law enforcement, have advocated in the legislature to retain existing firearms restrictions and to even expand them. If elected governor, what will you do relative to the advocacy of the administrative branch as to the Second Amendment issues in the Tennessee legislature?
Well, I would begin by appointing leadership to the various departments of state government that share my expansive view of what the Second Amendment means and how it should be applied in our state. And so I would be putting in place people who believed that we ought to have true constitutional carry in Tennessee, and obviously then would not, hopefully not have people who would be advocating for restricting those rights. But obviously I would be vigilant. I understand as a private business person who has delegated responsibilities to people, that it's the responsibility that you have then to make sure that they're following through on the wishes that you represented. So because I have actively campaigned on this, I would fulfill my promises that I've made as a candidate to the people of Tennessee. And we'd be sure that administratively within state government, that anyone who disagreed with those policies was, corrected in whatever misinterpretation or misunderstanding they had, and if necessary, moved aside to make room for people who did understand what the priorities of the administration are with respect to upholding our rights.
If elected governor, you will have the authority to appoint appellate and Supreme Court justices. What steps will you take to verify that any such candidates have a proven history of supporting the expansion and restoration of all constitutionally protected rights, including the Second Amendment?
Well, so I would anticipate not only in terms of reviewing the credentials of those who are applying for judicial positions, but also the groups that are charged with considering those credentials and making recommendations to the governor that that I fully vet their commitment to the ideas that I've espoused as a candidate. Sometimes I guess you would have to say there are going to be those times when maybe you don't have absolutely definitive proof of where somebody is on these issues. And so then I think you look to the broader context of the things that they've said and done and how they've handled themselves in their personal lives to try to provide as much insight as possible. As much so as possible, though, you want to try to find people who have a proven track record. But there are times, obviously, I was once a candidate for office, having not previously served. And so, all I had to demonstrate, my tendencies or my beliefs was how I had behaved in terms of the issues that I had supported and the groups that I had supported. And so sometimes there's going to have to be a little bit of intuition about whether someone's personal life choices or whatever other previous career choices they've made, whether they affirm or confirm how they actually feel about these issues. But as much so as possible, you want to get people who have a proven track record. We've all seen, and I think it's safe to say, been disappointed by, and I assume the presidents who've appointed some of our current Supreme Court justices are profoundly disappointed when, frankly, they don't live up to our expectations about how they would view some of these issues. And so that's an unfortunate risk that sometimes you have to take. As much so as is possible, I think you vet those positions with the people who step forward, and it would be my intention to put, in terms of the Judicial Selection Commission appointees, that we put people in place who will be rigorous in getting to the answers to the question about whether potential nominees or potential appointees meet those criteria.
What would you like to tell potential voters to demonstrate to them that when it comes to the Second Amendment, including specific prior actions, that you are the only candidate that deserves their support?
Well, so with respect to Second Amendment issues, I have had a consistent, I think, unfailing voting record of standing up for and supporting the Second Amendment rights of United States citizens. And so I would point to that record, which I think is unblemished insofar as I'm aware. Now, sometimes, the votes that we take here in Washington become very complicated as the legislative process takes its twists and turns. But I've always endeavored to not only vote correctly, but to be proactive and have always instructed my staff to be scouring the bills that have been introduced to look for opportunities, and then where we've found holes to step forward and support legislation alongside my fellow members of Congress to vindicate fully the rights of United States citizens to keep and bear arms, including removing things like just this week, I voted to support a bill that would, make it illegal to put merchant category codes in place that might help the federal government track the purchase of firearms, which I think would be a horrendous thing, and clearly is an attempt by some at the federal level to circumvent the protections that exist under the Second Amendment by allowing private actors to gather information that future government actors might use as a source or a resource for determining who might be holding firearms in our country. And so, we have to make sure that whatever the policies are that are put in place, that we are not only protecting the right to keep and bear arms, but we're protecting the identity of those who have chosen to avail ourselves of those rights. So certainly we've seen throughout the scope of history that governments, will try in future years sometimes to use that information to ferret out who they want to target and go after. We don't want to equip our federal government or our state and local governments with that kind of information. And so the keeping, our identities in terms of our ownership of firearms as private as possible, I think always ought to be the goal. And I would work hard to advance that. And I have. I've also, supported financially with my own resources those groups who I believe are defending our rights. The various groups that advocate for gun ownership and for defending the Second Amendment. I've advocated for those groups and would continue to do that as I move forward.
Well, Representative, we certainly appreciate your time. I understand that you're under the onus of leadership at the House. You're actually at work, unlike the Senate, who's on vacation at this point. So we've had to dodge around several times to get this schedule, but I really appreciate you taking the time to get your information out so that we can share it with my constituents here in Tennessee. And we wish you all the best.
Well, thank you. And I just occurs to me, I left a couple of things out that I've done. So one of those is sought out and involved myself in signing on to and helping to make sure that friend of the court briefs are offered by those of us in Congress in the very weighty issues of the day and the cases that come forward. I've joined in many letters to the administration, both in the prior administration that was not friendly to our gun rights, but in friendly administrations in the time that I've served, to support their work to make sure that we're vindicating our U.S. constitutional rights. And I would continue to do that if, in the capacity as governor, when it's appropriate at both the state and national level, is to weigh in and use the power of the executive branch of Tennessee state government to try to advance the cause of the Second Amendment at both the state and national level.
Again, Representative, we certainly appreciate your time, and we'll see how the voters turn out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Archie. I appreciate you, and I appreciate the Tennessee Firearms Association and the work that you do to stand up for our rights.